Throughout history, it's been a common belief that social events, be it war, prosperity, civil protest, or even the latest fad, dictate society's overall social mood. A strong economy, great leaders, an attractive stock market, and even fun pop cultural trends create a positive social mood. Conversely, a bad economy, inept leadership, an asthmatic stock market, and disturbing pop cultural trends create a negative, fearful social mood. At least, that is the presumed cause and effect relationship. But camouflaged by the small town of Gainesville, Georgia, there's a group of researchers who believe the exact opposite is true. The Socionomics Institute hypothesized that social mood determines the character of social events, not the other way around. So a positive, upbeat society creates a strong economy, makes leaders appear talented, generates the desire to buy stocks, and produces happy pop cultural trends, while a nervous, fearful society creates a recession, makes leaders appear inept, goes to war, and produces negative themes in popular culture. And if that isn't radical enough, this seeming paradox in cause and effect can be linked not only to facts of human psychology, but even to biological principles found in the natural world. The Institute believes that these social mood trends follow a discernible pattern, a pattern that involves repetition and thus a degree of predictability. A pattern that the Institute believes could prove to be history's hidden engine. To explore socionomics, we begin in the last place you would ever think to start. For centuries, fashion has been one of the more colorful ways humans express themselves. Our choices of clothing speak about how we in society are feeling. Who could help but notice the ducktail and black leather of the 1950s delinquent, the tie-dyed shirts and long hair of the 60s hippie, the polyester-clad disco kings of the 70s, the big hair of the 80s or the 90s body piercings? Participants in these trends would certainly be surprised to discover that their fashion statements are also linked to something else.
Many on Wall Street are wondering how much lower can these markets go?
In recent decades, a handful of financial analysts have observed a correlation between the stock market and fashion. In the late 1960s, financial researcher Ralph Rotnam's hemline indicator correlated the length of women's dresses to the rise and fall of the stock market. This became the first roughly quantified measure of the link between popular culture and financial trends.
The indicator said that you bought stocks when hemlines were low and you sold stocks when hemlines were high.
The battle began with a bomb, the HH bomb. HH for higher hemline.
What you're really dealing with are standards of the current times, what the people were going through. Until we got to the late 20s when the flappers came in and, the dresses got a lot shorter and the dances got a lot wilder. Depression came in and all of a sudden the hemlines started coming down again. You gradually started seeing hemlines coming back higher in the late 30s, early 40s, and we got into the 60s with a long-term bull market where hemlines just kept on getting smaller and smaller, and whoever can forget Goldie Hawn running around with those miniskirts on, Rowan and Martin's laughing, but that was the top of the market.
In the early 70s, we'd just gone through a miniskirt phase, and I noticed that hemlines had gone down. People were wearing granny gowns and pantsuits, and as hemlines went down, the market went down.
It wasn't until the mid-80s that market analyst Robert Prechter postulated an array of significant links between popular culture and the stock market. In a 1985 report, Prechter explored connections between stock prices and music, movies, television, and even pop stardom.
For a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, the medicine go down.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
Could the popularity of Mary Poppins or Dracula actually shed light on a social mood that also propels the stock market? According to Prechter, it does just that.
All of the popular, groundbreaking horror movies were produced in bear markets. Dracula, Frankenstein, King Kong, The Mummy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, all of those were produced from 1931 to 1933, 2 short years, during which time the Dow Jones Industrial Average was plummeting. You didn't have a situation like that again for decades until the late 1960s into the early 1980s. And then you had Halloween, Night of the Living Dead, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and all of these, again, groundbreaking horror movies that were popular, and you don't see that sort of thing in bull markets. There's always a mix, of course. There are movies of all types produced all the time. The question is the frequency, the popularity, the intensity. When you see horror movies from bull markets, you find out generally they're derivative, or they're hokey, or they're humorous, but it's the ones produced in bear markets that shock people.
While horror movies are a staple of falling markets, adventure, heroism, and family fare are more popular when stocks are rising. And what film company best captures the spirit of a perky, upbeat society? In a word, Disney.
Who are you, my dear?
Oh, how silly of me. I'm Snow White.
In 1937, at the top of a roaring bull market, Disney released his first major animated feature film, Snow White. It was a smash hit. He continued in that genre for the next 30 years with hit after hit as the stock market was rising and the social mood was rising. Then, when the stock market topped out in the late 1960s, suddenly it was as if somebody had flipped a switch on the Disney machine, and the studio did not produce a single major cartoon feature smash hit from the late 1960s all the way through most of the 1980s. And of course, most of that period was a bear market in stocks while they were going sideways to down.
Ariel, listen to me. The human world, it's a mess.
As the market recovered in the 1980s, suddenly the Disney machine began to come back to life. And once again, the families were pouring into the theaters to see Disney films. This is not a coincidence. This is the entertainment industry giving the public what it wants when it wants it.
The correlations don't stop with fashion and movies either.
The stock market is incredibly sensitive to social mood. If you really pay attention, you can almost hear the Dow going up and down over the airwaves. This goes back as far as we can trace pop music, but I think many people alive today can relate to the changes just over the last 50 years. You'll see that when the stock market is rising, that songs tend to be joyous and fun, and when the stock market is falling, they tend to be somber or angry.
We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
I'm all shook up.
You know you make me wanna shout.
Everybody's going surfing. City, here we go.
I wanna hold your hand.
But you really got me. I'm into something good.
That's spice and all things nice.
Yummy, yummy, yummy. I got love in my tummy.
So happy together.
Life, I love you.
Beautiful morning.
Don't you want somebody to love?
Excuse me while I kiss the sky.
See the bad moon rising. Been dazed and confused.
And the sign said, long-haired freaky people need not apply.
Smoke on the water.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Love hurts. All by myself.
And solitaire's the only game in town.
All we are is dust in the wind.
I am an antichrist.
Nothing to do, nowhere to go home.
I want to love you. We are living in a
Is popular culture paving the way for the stock market? Or is it the other way around? Or is there another explanation entirely?
They all track each other because they all stem from the same cause, which is the rise and fall in overall social mood. When the mood is positive, people want to listen to happy music, they want to wear frisky clothes, and they want to buy stocks. When they're in a negative mood, their tendencies are in the opposite direction.
As a financial journalist in 1985, I became interested in Bob Prechter's financial analysis, which seemed to have a great deal of merit to it. But it was the release of the Pop Culture Report that really jumped the tracks from something that was germane to Wall Street to the broader social realm.
So, how's the issue going?
Kendall's interest led to a new career with Prechter's financial forecasting company, Elliott Wave International. His main task, researching cultural trends.
Pop culture trends that track along with the stock market may seem like that's just interesting curiosities rather than groundbreaking research, but there has to be a lot more to it.
People do much more than represent their mood through passive self-expression. They also act on those moods. And I think that that is what gives rise to history. They give rise to political trends, economic trends, and I believe even philosophic and scientific trends.
When we look at 300 years of stock market history, we see that the economy follows the primary register of social mood, the stock market. When the trend in social mood is up, people are adventurous and productive. When the trend reverses, they become cautious and produce less.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hail the end of the war in Europe.
The environment is always more peaceful after a bull market has been going on for a while. The hypothesis is that as people's mood improves, they feel less like fighting. The opposite happens in a bear market. As people get angrier and more fearful, they begin to feel more like fighting or defending themselves or attacking someone else. Wars take time to mobilize, so they don't generally erupt early in bear markets. They tend to erupt very late in bear markets. In fact, it's usually not on the first decline of a bear market, but in the second decline when war tends to break out.
The size of a war is almost always related to the size of the bear market that creates it.
When we look at a chart of the US stock market, we see that the Civil War followed the 24-year bear market that ended in 1859, and that World War II followed the bear market of the early 30s. These two wars followed the largest bear markets and were the largest in terms of American casualties.
We will carry the fight to the people in the fall.
The outcome of elections, says Prechter, are also in sync with the stock market.
The moods that drive social trends also determine how the electorate chooses a president and how they rate his performance once he's in office. It's quite simple to observe. The bull market brings you re-elections, and the bear markets bring you throw the bums out.
Rising stock market. An unopposed Washington wins a second term. Rising stock market. Jefferson wins a second term in a landslide. The same goes for Monroe and Jackson. During the bear market of 1835 to 1842, Van Buren is ousted by a landslide. During the next bull market, we see that Lincoln, Grant, Roosevelt, and Coolidge all win second terms by landslides. But when the market collapses in the early 30s, Hoover is ousted in a landslide. The next bull market saw second-term landslide elections for Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Johnson, and Nixon.
Well, my favorite example is Nixon. He won re-election in a landslide at the top of a big bull market and was hounded from office less than 2 years later in the biggest bear market in 40 years.
Carter also felt the brunt of that downtrend, losing in 1980 in a landslide. The bull market of the 80s and 90s saw re-elections for Reagan and Clinton.
People on the left wonder how anybody could like Ronald Reagan. People on the right wonder how anybody could like Bill Clinton. And now we know the answer. They were both Teflon coated from this positive bull market mood that was going on through the 80s and 90s.
These ideas represent a more comprehensive hypothesis, which Prechter calls the socionomic insight. This hypothesis, first introduced in Prechter's work, The Wave Principle of Human Social Behavior, proposes that events do not dictate the character of social mood, as almost everyone presumes, but the opposite is true. Social mood dictates the character of social events.
I first became interested in Prechter's work on socionomics near the end of the high-tech mania and began reading Human Social Behavior. The stark contrast between his viewpoint, the and that of conventional wisdom at the time was striking to say the least.
Gordon Graham is the director of the Socionomics Institute, a newly formed think tank designed to conduct socionomic studies and introduce the socionomic insight to academia. Deepak Goel is a colleague.
You know, the sheer potential of this theory to identify patterns associated with all sociological phenomena, not just the market, is very intriguing.
Socionomics explains better than any alternative why social events unfold as they do.
Okay, socionomics recognizes that the stock market and cultural trends are linked. But the key to understanding why social mood is the driving factor is that the stock market is patterned.
Might the vicissitudes of social mood really be patterned? For answers, we begin with R.N. Elliott, who pioneered this research in the 1930s and 1940s.
R.N. Elliott was a corporate accountant who specialized in financial restructuring. He was taken ill later in life, and during his recovery, took an interest in the stock market and began a detailed investigation.
Elliott identified an overall pattern to fundamental market movement. The pattern occurs over and over again in the markets. Soon he realized that if you can identify where you are in the pattern, then you can predict where prices are likely to go next. The basic pattern unfolds in 5 waves. The 3 waves in the direction of the main trend are labeled 1, 3, and 5, which are separated by 2 interruptions labeled 2 and 4. The essential form, then, is 5 waves of net movement in the direction of the one larger trend, followed by 3 waves of net movement against it, progressing in 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Elliott further observed that these patterns were the same regardless of scale, the smaller versions linked to form larger ones, and so on. Bob Prechter became involved with Elliott's Wave Principle in the 1970s.
I'd been investigating methods of market analysis for quite some time, and I got curious about this obscure idea called the Wave Principle. I wanted to know if some guy had imposed his idea of a pattern onto the market, or was it really there? I started keeping my own hourly charts, and I was quite amazed to find that he indeed explained the patterns that were there. I saw them over and over again, every hour, every day, every week, every month. So I had to know more. And first thing I did was I contacted the Library of Congress, and they didn't have his works, but I finally found them on microfilm in the New York Public Library. So I had copies made, and I found a wealth of material, a complete, all-encompassing theory of the stock market that had been lost to academia and Wall Street practitioners for all those years.
Prechter became so intrigued by the Wave Principle that he soon republished Elliott's original books in a volume called R.N. Elliott's Masterworks. In the meantime, he contacted financier A.J. Frost.
Frost had been a colleague of Hamilton Bolton's, who, along with a very well-known financial analyst named Charles Collins, kept Elliott's theories alive throughout the 1950s and 60s. And Frost and I just hit it off great from the first minute, and we decided to get together, consolidate all of Elliott's ideas, and put them into one volume.
The book Elliott Wave Principle would become the definitive guide to discerning the market's forms. Elliott Wave Principle has sold over 100,000 copies and has been translated into a dozen languages.
We've had now too high an inflation rate for the last 10 years.
In 1978, as inflation accelerated and after the Dow fell to 780, there was widespread pessimism. Elliott Wave Principle made a bold forecast for the financial future. This chart shows the Dow up to 1978. This chart shows Frost and Prechter's forecast. They expected a great bull market into the 1980s. The forecast came true. The bull market charged ahead further than Frost and Prechter expected, but the advance stayed true to form.
I first heard about the Wave Principle in an article that mentioned Bob Prechter, who at the time had just won the United States Trading Championship with a huge gain in a very short amount of time. And I was interested in what made him successful. What was he using in his methodology that it might help me in what I was doing at the time. The article mentioned the Wave Principle, and that really started me on my journey as to what it was and how I might use it.
Hochberg began using the Wave Principle successfully and eventually joined Prechter at Elliott Wave International.
The Wave Principle is really a unique tool to help forecast the markets because what it does is help you quantify emotion, which I think is probably the single most important variable within the investment process. Now, because it's a mathematical principle, it really doesn't matter what the fundamentals are at the time, whether it's wars or scandals or maybe a Fed statement, the market will always trace out Elliott Wave patterns. Now, Bob and I have both made some beautiful forecasts, and forecasts that really haven't worked out as we had anticipated. But you can do some things that are unique with a wave principle, and one of the examples is what happened around 9/11.
It was one of the most highly emotional times in US history, and the stock market was shut down. The night of the tragedy, Prechter released a chart forecasting the S&P Composite Index.
Well, remember that in September 2001, the S&P had already been falling for a year and a half. So by 9/11, it was just days away from finishing 5 waves down, which means it was days away from the start of a very big rally. And that's exactly what happened. Terrorism threw almost everyone off, but it had absolutely nothing to do with our outlook. I mean, there was no terrorism at the high in 2000. It was almost all good news, and that's when you were supposed to be selling. So, sure, waves can throw you off now and then, but if you try to follow the news, it will almost always make you do the wrong thing. The wave principle can also be used to forecast macroeconomic changes. To investigate this, I went back to the charts and I compared changes in social mood against the occurrence of economic expansions and recessions. And what I found was that changes in the economy do not precede and cause changes in social mood, which is what most people think. But in fact, it was the opposite. The social mood changes preceded changes in the economy.
In this chart, Prechter shows these changes in social mood as represented by the stock market, with past recessions indicated by the orange areas and economic expansions indicated by the clear areas.
In not a single case did a recession occur before the stock market turned down, or a recovery out of recession occur before the stock market turned up. The stock market always turns with or before the economy. Now, what's far more interesting to me is that the change in economic behavior is commensurate with the size of the change in stock market behavior. For example, in 1929-32, the biggest decline of the past century ultimately brought about a very deep depression, whereas milder pullbacks in the stock market coincide with recessions or mild changes in the economic figures. So if you can identify the beginning of a major turn in the stock market, then you can essentially predict a recession or an economic recovery.
Forecasting the economy using the stock market is one thing, but forecasting the stock market itself is a bigger challenge. Most Wall Street professionals don't use any method to try to forecast the market. They say it can't be done and that it's a waste of time. Even among forecasters, there are those who think that the wave principle is invalid.
Elliott Wave is centered on the structure of the market, and it leaves out things like sentiment, like volume, like relative strength, and to some extent cycles. So if you're only concerned with the wave count, I think you're leaving out a lot of valuable information. So I think from that perspective, there's a fault in Elliott Wave theory.
What is the underlying assumptions that make it work? And underlying assumption number one is no one ever learns. And I find that to be absolutely an unrealistic assumption. Number two assumption is that whatever events are impacting the economy is going to respond the same way. And I find that, again, to be an absolutely unrealistic assumption.
I've just looked at so many wave structures. I've never seen anything that really makes sense. And one thing that's mind-boggling to me is that if you see a wave that's bigger than the previous wave, all of a sudden you change your old count, and therefore the roadmap that you're relying so heavily on is changed.
Basically saying that everything that has already happened tells you all you need to know about what will happen really throws away a lot of behavior and a lot of understanding of how behavior changes.
Despite ever-present skepticism and sometimes virulent detraction, the caliber of the wave principle's supporters has recently risen.
Over 90% of the business economists interviewed said that in 2001 there was no possibility of a recession in the United States, and they were completely wrong. We already knew the market had gone down, so the idea was that we will get it into a recession very soon. But the tools from the wave principle is that you can predict when this bull market will turn into a bear market. So not only we can say once the stock market goes down, then we know a recession is coming. But we can also say once we are in an advance in the fifth wave, we know that the next movement is a bear market. That increases macroeconomics knowledge like 1,000,000%.
There's a group of economists that basically are trying to help the budgeting process of the business world or help in the direction of financial behavior. And those economists tend to be cautious, and as a result say that, well, what happened in the past may deviate a little bit this way or a little bit that way, but won't come out and say, hey, we're in trouble, or this is great, and make the dramatic statements. And so as a result, they are going to be wrong when the dramatic events occur. And you will find that almost all consensus forecasts miss turns.
What makes the wave principle unique is its ability to predict major turning points in the face of almost completely unanimous agreement that the old trend will continue.
Well, with the wave principle, you can predict probabilistically what the next trend is likely to be. But once you've got that down, you can predict with certainty what the social aspects of that trend are going to be. And that's what's really useful. Now, it's helpful to go back in history and say that in past bull markets, people watched family fare movies and liked happy pop music, and they liked baseball and basketball, and women wore shorter skirts with brighter colors and so on. But it's another thing to look forward and say, for example, in the next bear market, we will have cutting-edge horror movies, colors will get darker in fashion, skirt lengths will fall, and all that sort of thing. These are invaluable insights. Can you imagine if you were in the sports field or music industry or fashion or film, and you had this kind of insight in advance? Over and over again, the stock market precedes changes in the economy and politics. Now, once you get the chronology right, you can see that social events don't cause changes in social mood, they are the result. Social mood governs social events. I call that the socionomic hypothesis or the socionomic insight. I think it's a principle, which means that there are no exceptions to it ever.
The days of Iraq acting as an outlaw state are coming to an end.
The socionomic hypothesis is that things we often think of as causes are not causes at all, but effects, and the things we think of as effects are causes.
The general consensus on the street and in the market is when there's a move in the market, this move was catalyzed or triggered by a piece of data, a piece of news, an economic event, that this cause and effect relationship starts with the outside cause affecting the market. Socionomics reverses that.
Very rarely do we consider the hemline on skirts to be related to politics, or the type of popular music going on right now to be related to the economy. That's not usually the way we think. And this hypothesis challenges you to think that way.
To further illustrate this point, Prechter applied the socionomic insight to the Enron scandal.
When the Enron scandal broke, it was a common view that it discouraged investors and hurt investor confidence. The fact is, it did nothing of the kind.
In this chart, Prechter shows that the social mood, represented by the stock market, had trended negatively for a year and a half before the Enron scandal broke. As the scandal developed, stocks actually rose, and so did other gauges of social mood, such as consumer sentiment.
The corporate scandals that kept coming out in the year 2002, that led to Congress and the President signing a law, the Public Accounting Reform and Investor Protection Act, that created a lot more legislation. So the scandals were generating crisis in confidence, and were also generating this political action. Now, socionomics kind of flips that around, and it says that the social mood was already low, and it was the social mood that caused the reaction. So, which view might be right? I went back to the late 1990s, because here, now we're in a great bull market. The social mood is very high. If we have corporate scandals that are occurring at that time, then we can kind of test the difference between the two hypotheses. And indeed we had. If you go back and look, we find out that there are a lot of accounting manipulation. There are a lot of accusations of fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission was investigating and finding problems at many companies. So we have the same situation, scandal, but in a different environment, high mood versus low social mood. What happened? Did people demand more protection when these scandals come out? Did Congress enact laws? The answer was no. During the high social mood time, people did not demand more protection. And in fact, there was one person out there who was recommending more regulation, and that was the Securities and Exchange Commissioner. The chairman at that time was Arthur Levitt.
In order to enhance investor protection, we're going to consider stronger regulation in the area of
proposed new legislation in 1999. Congress defeated it. It's almost this same exact legislation that 2 years later, in 2002, when the social mood was very low, it was then that Congress enacted almost those same exact laws. So it's not, so really which hypothesis describes this better? It's socionomics. It's the social mood determining the reaction instead of the reaction determining the social mood.
With socionomics, you can predict the ebb and flow of all kinds of cultural trends, from legislative trends and election results to student unrest, peace and reconciliation, religious conflict, prosperity and depression, even the occasional dark age or golden age.
Most people walk through life looking behind them at what's already occurred, but adopting the socionomic perspective is no small matter. It quite literally changes how you interpret everything, and it's a powerful tool. In fact, it's the first tool we've ever had to forecast the social future.
I just called Governor Clinton over in Little Rock and offered my congratulations.
Socionomic forecasting has seen success in a number of areas, including politics, where Socionomics predicted a failed re-election bid by George Bush Sr. in 1992, when his approval rating was 90%. It also called the reversal of public acclaim for Michael Jackson at his peak.
Tell her to go to hell.
And even forecast a retrenchment in baseball attendance over a year before the players' strike of 1994 cancelled the World Series. Could these examples be coincidences or selective citation?
There is a dramatic amount of information available. If you take subsets of that information, you can almost create any picture.
There's actually a great book out now. It's called Fooled by Randomness. It suggests that sometimes technicians, see patterns that aren't really patterns or can't be proved.
Are you using a model that captures whatever subset of all available information fits into your current category? And if that's what you're doing, then over time you're going to be eliminating relevant information, basically to find your own picture.
At one stage, the stock market is so rich of numbers, and there is a very famous Ramsey theorem in mathematics that tells you that any sufficiently complex system will exhibit absolutely any pattern you want. For example, the naming of constellations in the sky, you have 3,000 stars that are visible, and they show many types of patterns. You can recognize whatever pattern you want. Our brain has been wired due to evolution to recognize patterns very efficiently. Why? Because we wanted to decipher very fast the tiny motion of a grass hiding a lion going to jump on us. The big danger for Bob, for Elliott Wave theorists or practitioners, and for us scientists, is to go beyond what is reality, what is real signal, and to extract too much information out of the noise.
Well, people do have a tendency toward pattern imposition, but that's not what's happening here. If it were, there would be dozens of pattern theories of the stock market, just as there are dozens of constellations. But what Elliott found was one essentially repeating pattern. It would be as if you looked up in the sky and every constellation looked like Orion, and all of those little Orions fit together to make one big Orion, and so on. That's what's happening in the stock market. That's what's remarkable.
As it turns out, the mathematics behind nature's most vibrant forms play an important role in the wave principle and socionomics. What Elliott described decades ago today are called fractals, which are irregularly shaped objects that are self-similar at different scales. This self-similarity reveals order in many natural objects that at first glance seem random.
A classic example of a fractal is a stalk of broccoli. The whole stalk is a similar version of the individual piece that grows on the top. If you break that off, you're left again with a similar version of the whole stalk. This relationship has proved to be universal in nature, as represented by mountain ranges, cloud formations, and the distributions of galaxies.
A common characteristic of fractal systems is branching. Trees, circulatory systems, and rivers, for example, all display branching fractal patterns.
There are lots of fractal systems within the body. In my work on the heart is actually full of fractals. The most famous example of it is the blood vessels coming into the heart. The coronary circulation is a pattern of a branching network of blood vessels that's typically fractal, where the branching structures look very similar at different scales.
Even snowflakes, known for their dissimilarity from each other, display a fractal pattern internally.
What R.N. Elliott discovered 40 years ahead of modern mathematicians is that the stock market is a fractal. Not only that, he said it's a specific fractal. That's one heck of an achievement for somebody without a computer.
The tiniest recorded change in stock prices is called the tick. Some ticks occur in less than a second.
This tick graph covers 3 minutes of trading of the Dow on October 6, 1997. You see here the typical 5-wave pattern of the wave principle.
If we change the scale of time, we still see the same pattern.
Next we show an hourly in September 97. This is a daily in 1962. A weekly in 1974-75. A monthly from 1932 to 42. A yearly from 1929 to present. And finally, this is a decade-by-decade graph from 1700 to present. All of these graphs show the typical 5-wave pattern of the wave principle, in spite of the fact that they differ in time spans by over 30 million to 1. In other words, the first one was 3 minutes and the last is 300 years, and they show the same structure.
A fractal is not the only ubiquitous natural phenomenon whose essence is its form. Another is the spiral. The logarithmic spiral depicts growth and expansion in the universe. For example, if we look at the branching tendencies of a tree, we see that as time progresses, one spiral expands as the number of branches increases, and another spiral contracts as the circumference of branches decreases. Spirals are reflected in structures as diverse as seashells, pine cones, sunflowers, whirlpools, and hurricanes. And as with fractals, we can see spirals at many different scales, from the growth of an embryo to a galaxy. So how do these spirals connect to socionomics?
The idealized depiction of the stock market's progress can be seen as a spiral. The top of each successive wave of one higher degree serves as a touch point for the exponential expansion. And pretty soon it begins to look like the pattern of a hurricane or galaxy. Now, what are stock prices? They are humanity's valuation of its own productive capacity. So human progress and regress form one of nature's growth patterns.
Fractals and spirals reveal an underlying order within many structures that on the surface seem chaotic. Progress and growth seem to occur naturally by these forms. But there could be an even more intimate connection to nature. In the 13th century, a mathematician named Leonardo Fibonacci discovered an important number sequence.
It's a very simple sequence of numbers, starting with the number 1 twice. Each succeeding number in the sequence is the sum of the 2 preceding ones. So the sequence goes 1, 1, and 2, and 3, and 5, and so on. And for reasons that are pretty mysterious, this sequence of numbers seems to appear in a wide variety of places in the natural world.
R.N. Elliott observed that the fractal he called the wave principle was built according to the Fibonacci sequence of numbers, which is governed by a ratio called the golden mean, or phi. The ratio of any two conjugative numbers in this sequence approaches phi. That is an irrational number, which is approximately 0.618. If you look at the Elliott wave patterns, these patterns involve a certain number of waves called impulse waves and corrective waves. Each type of wave, when broken down into its components, reproduces the Fibonacci sequence as the degrees of subdivision increase.
The 5 waves of progress and 3 waves of regress is the essential form of markets. If there were no fluctuation, there would be no change. So you need at least 3 waves to get fluctuation. Therefore, the 5-3 pattern is the most efficient way of achieving both fluctuation and progress. Nature is efficient, and this pattern is no exception.
The importance of the Fibonacci sequence in nature, just like the importance of fractals and spirals, is its ability to create a robust and efficient method of growth. There's a wealth of biological, psychological, and sociological evidence that supports the connection.
For example, the Fibonacci sequence is in flowerhead arrangements. In this example, notice how from stem to tip it subdivides 1, 2, 3, and 5. In the human body, we find a Fibonacci branching pattern as well. 5 appendages encompassing legs, arms, and head. 3 subdivisions within the arms and legs. 5 subdivisions off the hands and feet, and 3 subdivisions in the fingers and toes.
Then we find the Fibonacci ratio in heart muscles, in bronchial tube branching, even in the electrical potential of neurons, and as Roger Penrose pointed out, even in the arrangement of the brain's microtubules.
The DNA molecule, the code for life, is made up of 2 intertwining spirals. We find the 0.618 ratio between the helix's width and cycle length.
The Fibonacci ratio may even regulate the way we think.
In the 1950s, psychologist George Kelly tested the judgments people make on a positive-negative scale. He assumed that in value-neutral situations, the average response would be 50-50, but he found that in fact, it's 62-38, consistently weighted towards the positive or optimistic side. Researchers have confirmed his findings in numerous studies.
For example, when you ask people to judge how dark a piece of gray paper is, the answers don't produce a bell curve as you might think. They bulge at the 62% point. If you ask subjects to sort objects into 2 piles, or rate acquaintances' character traits, or make choices in situations of uncertainty, you get the same result.
This bias extends to collective behavior. Stock market analyst Robert Ray showed in the early 1930s that, on average, bear markets tended to relate to bull markets by the Fibonacci ratio in both time and price. And recent studies show the same tendency in voting patterns.
It's easy enough to imagine that, or make claims, well, this Fibonacci sequence and the way that it appears in very many areas of life is just like some kind of number mysticism. It's equally easy to take the position to say, look, when the same thing keeps occurring in such a wide spectrum of areas, there has to be some underlying reason for it. I tend to the latter point of view.
The robustness, resilience, and efficiency of all these universal forms, spirals, fractals, and Fibonacci relationships, may be connected to collective social mood. Nature prefers the most efficient path. In the case of the wave principle, though, the efficiency is not in the individual's biology, but the efficiency in the progress of the species.
The idea that fractal patterns, spirals, and Fibonacci growth all exist in the stock market is certainly remarkable. But then when you consider that the stock market itself is a measure of humanity's productive capacity, and then when you consider that cultural trends ebb and flow with that pattern, I mean, the resulting implications are quite grand, really.
Frost and Prechter stated in Elliott Wave Principle that the same law that shapes living creatures and galaxies is inherent in the mentation and activities of human societies.
The wave principle reveals that the human social experience derives from the tension between the opposing forces of progress and regress. Its ruling ratio is phi, the same ratio that rules branching fractals and spirals in nature. So this is one of nature's fundamental arrangements.
But there is still one key element to explore. That is, an understanding of why human interaction accommodates the wave principle.
The wave principle says markets are pattern. Well, whatever causes that pattern to be so very well defined in form is probably also pattern.
But why were they patterned? Why do people buy and sell stocks? Why do they listen to certain music? Why do they do all of the things that make these patterns apparent? To answer these questions, Prechter gathered the latest studies on the psychological aspects of human social behavior. And what he found was that scientists had been increasingly describing an unconscious impulse in humans that is commonly associated only with lower animals: herding.
The herding theory is a very important concept within the psychology of investing. I see much evidence that it's true, going back to the idea of why do people behave in a crowd all together rather than thinking independently. People have a sense of belonging when they're in the herd. It's much more comfortable to go with the crowd than it is to take a contrarian or independent point of view. So from an emotional standpoint, if you buy the stock that everybody else is saying is great, you're going to be comfortable, especially when it's going up. To make a more independent decision is going to cause you some anxiety.
There's a column called Herd on the Street, H-E-A-R-D, and professionals often refer to it as herd, H-E-R-D, because we in the business know that that's the way we act at times.
We also follow the experts on the stock market, even though good research has shown that the experts are really wrong most of the time.
There have been studies, very profound studies, checking, for example, the independence versus dependence between analysts. They are very much saying the same thing. They are always calling friends, colleagues, okay, what do you think about this? Trying to take the temperature of the feelings. And so this means clearly that the decision that a stockbroker or an investor is making on the market is not, an isolated fact. It's linked with the decision with the other.
Why do we have a herding impulse? Research has shown that herding could be an instinctual process governed by the primitive areas of our brains. Dr. Paul MacLean's triune brain theory hypothesizes three separate parts to our brain. Paul Montgomery was the first market analyst to link a theory of the segmented human mind to pattern group behavior.
The triune concept suggests that the human forebrain is best understood as consisting of a hierarchy of three fundamentally distinct brain systems. Now these three neural systems, the reticular or reptilian complex, the limbic system, and the neocortex, are all radically different one from the other, both in form and function. Nevertheless, the three are also highly interrelated. Now, this being the case, it appears that much human behavior can be explained only as the product of three radically different minds: our primal mind, our emotional mind, and our rational mind.
One part of the brain is the spinal cord, the midbrain, and the cerebellum, which is the primitive brain and the seat of most of the functions that have to do with basic life. For example, breathing resides there.
That part of the brain controls herding behavior, flocking behavior, schooling behavior in fish.
The limbic system is the part of the brain that contains emotions and does connect us to some lower animals and includes structures such as the thalamus and the amygdala and the hippocampus.
The thinking done by the primitive brainstem and the limbic system is not irrational, it's pre-rational, primitive, aimed at survival in a primeval setting. Fleeing, fighting, acquiring, herding, these are all unconscious impulses aimed at survival. Now, what's more is that several scientific studies show that the limbic system is faster than the neocortex. It also regulates the amplitude of emotions so that an intense emotion can drown out rational thought.
We can see from an evolutionary standpoint why that's a desirable thing, because there are times when somebody doesn't need to stop and think about the danger, but instead to immediately act or react.
It's also disassociated from time. So whatever that part of the brain wants, it wants now.
But from an investment standpoint, the limbic system is not helpful.
It's clear that emotional factors in the stock market play a major role, and that the development of the brain is such that the connections between the cortex and the limbic system is to a certain extent disconnected, and that at moments of panic and moments of fear, that the limbic system takes over, and it's those things that determine the decisions at that time. Therefore, when people panic in the stock market, they're making their decisions primarily on an emotional level, not on the kind of rational level that we would think.
But on October 29, Black Tuesday, the bottom dropped out.
Some believe that the herding patterns of investors on Wall Street lead to financial crashes.
There is a collective behavior, people not knowing it, but do things that leads to a global behavior of the stock market, which is cooperative. One of the consequences of the cooperative phenomenon is the creation of a critical point. What is a critical point? It is when the order is so dominating that suddenly people are doing all the same thing, which is exactly what happens in stock market crashes, because everybody wants to sell at the same time, while in normal times, there are half the number of people who wants to sell and the other half wants to buy, and most of the people wants to do nothing, of course, but there is a very good balance.
It's easy, even for conventional economists, to go along with the idea that stock market panics are emotional and impulsive, but what I can't get them to see is that the upside is no different. Sure, herding animals panic occasionally, but much of the time they're just quietly grazing, but they're still herding, and that's the key to why humans keep forming Elliott Wave patterns. They're getting their cues from each other all the time.
I wish to reaffirm America's commitment to the Atlantic Alliance.
If we accept the wave principle, then we must concede that society, through government for example, cannot control or direct the social mood or the economy or even its own proclivity for peace or war. This conclusion seems hard for many people to accept.
Some people react to the wave principle with mild annoyance because it challenges the idea that human directors, such as politicians or central bankers, can control collective behavior and our social future.
I'm also not trying to pull the party to the left or the right or leave it alone. I'm trying to push it into a new future, which I think is what all the American people want.
We want to shut down government in general, full stop.
I don't think any person or agency can change social mood trends. But as an individual, you can act on your conclusions. And in the most extreme circumstances, you can harness the crowd to your benefit in a big bull market, for example, or get out of harm's way in a big social mood decline. To put it succinctly, it can make you rich or save your life.
Dr. Wayne Parker is director of the newly formed Socionomics Foundation.
The standard social science model treats man as a completely rational being, almost like a calculating machine, responding to external events with rational decisions, always in its own best interest. But we socionomists see man as a fundamentally rational and non-rational creature, acting both consciously and unconsciously. So in our view, it's really more useful to view man as an evolved biological organism with complex motivations, rather than simply as a passive reactor to external forces.
The wave principle describes a hidden engine of social experience that's both necessary and good, whether we like its current expression or not. The point is that living systems require setbacks to flourish. Now, the wave principle assures us that the setbacks are temporary and that the long-term trend of human progress is upward. I think that's a comforting message. You would put the smallest degree right on the top. But down here,
Socionomics is such a young theory that the scientific media are only beginning to take notice. There aren't many critics of it yet, but they are sure to appear, and probably soon.
Well, the first great challenge will be faced by socionomics is to get people to understand the concept and to understand it in its entirety. Secondly, once that's achieved, you have to motivate people enough to want to do research, to read the research, to follow this. So I think those will be the two great challenges for socionomics going forward.
I find that the socionomics hypothesis is very compelling. but it's at a very early stage, and there has not been a lot of what I would call rigorous research done to try to accept or reject it.
The reason we've formed the nonprofit Socionomics Foundation is to provide funding for scientists at universities to conduct socionomic research. We are interested in funding interdisciplinary studies as well as laboratory research related to socionomic theory.
I am in contact with people, and at this moment actually, to try and formulate what would be a coherent scientific research program to test the validity of this principle.
When we do this and show it as a study, we'll show 1 degree, and then you'll flip the page and show the next degree, and then the next degree. It'd be nice to have a composite at the end where they're all shown, one stacked on top of the other.
The bottom line is that socionomics and the hypothesis behind it are now open for debate. It could lead to a dead end, but it could also lead to a genuine revolution in the social sciences.
Sociology today is where physics was, 300 years ago? I think it's time to bring the study of human society into the realm of math and science, starting with a proper understanding of social causality.
Elliott stated, civilization rests upon change. Philosophers from Heraclitus to Lao Tzu to Nietzsche have celebrated opposing forces, strife and struggle, even cycles of creation and annihilation, all of which are different terms for the same inexorable succession of change.
Now we know for the first time that the succession of social mood change is patterned and that social moods produce social actions. So I think we have begun to understand no less than the operating mechanism that is essentially the engine of history.